Okay, let's jump in. If you're just stepping into the world of business, maybe finance, well, it can feel a bit much, right?
Oh, definitely. It's less like walking into a library and more like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly. Information everywhere, news, analysts, social media. It's just overwhelming. How do you even start to figure out what's signal and what's just noise?
Yeah. What's really important, what advice actually works, and maybe crucially, what are the big mistakes you absolutely need to avoid making?
That feeling, that sort of information overload, it's completely normal.
It is. And, traditional paths, they give you lots of specifics, maybe within finance or economics, but they don't always give you a framework for processing the whole messy reality.
You need more than just data points. You need, like, a way to think.
Precisely. A framework for thinking effectively.
And that fundamental challenge, especially for you listening, maybe navigating these early stages, that's exactly what brings us to today's deep dive.
Mm.
We're exploring some really powerful source material today, mostly centered around the wisdom of Charlie Munger, from Port Charlie's Almanack.
Right, that collection of his speeches and writings. It's become pretty legendary.
So our mission today is really to unpack why this collection is seen as so valuable, particularly if you're newer to business and finance.
Yeah, well, we want to look at the core problem he's tackling, head on that complexity challenge, and then dig into the solution he offers, which is, well, it's not what you might expect.
Definitely not. If you're thinking it's going to be a dry textbook full of charts, think again. Munger's approach, at least as it's presented in these sources, it pulls from everywhere.
Everywhere. History, psychology, physics, biology, things you wouldn't immediately connect to, say, making money.
So what is the central problem the source material says he's addressing?
It really boils down to
Hmm.
how do you get genuinely useful, practical wisdom? Wisdom for navigating complex stuff like business, investing, even just life. And critically, how do you avoid the really common, often painful, and, avoidable errors that trip so many people up?
Avoidable errors. That seems key.
Munger argues that just specializing in one field or only relying on what, say, formal education gives you, it's just not enough. Deeply insufficient, actually.
That really stood out to me from the sources, too. It's not just about aiming for success, but maybe even more about avoiding, like, catastrophic failure.
Right.
Reminds me of that line, something like, it's knowing what to avoid that's the hard part. He even uses those funny examples, avoid cocaine and racing trains. Simple but effective.
Exactly. And that principle is what he calls invert, always invert. Comes from the mathematician Jacobi.
Okay.
So if you have a tough problem, sometimes the best way to look at it is backwards. Ask,
Yeah.
what guarantees failure here?
Instead of how do I succeed, ask how do I make sure this blows up?
Precisely. And then you just rigorously avoid those things. Like, how do I guarantee failure in business? Well, be unreliable, be dishonest, don't deliver on promises. It makes the paths to avoid really clear. He learned early just to, faithfully do what you said you'd do. That alone prevents a whole category of basic failures.
Okay, so the problem is making good decisions and dodging bad ones in a messy world. If just knowing one subject isn't enough, what's the big solution Munger talks about in these sources?
His answer is building up worldly wisdom.
Worldly wisdom. Okay.
And the way to get that, he argues, is through using multiple mental models. The sources are really clear on this. You have to know the big, powerful ideas from all the major disciplines.
Just one or two.
No, a whole latticework of them, as he calls it.
This is where that famous man with the hammer idea comes in, isn't it?
That's the one. He uses it to show that if your only tool is a hammer, say, you only really understand economics, then every single problem starts to look like a nail you can fix with economics.
Right, and a psychologist sees psychology everywhere. An engineer sees engineering problems.
Exactly. And he sees that kind of siloed thinking as just deeply flawed for dealing with reality. The world isn't neatly divided like university departments are.
Makes sense.
Business problems, finance problems, they're these tangled knots. Yeah, there are economic incentives, sure, but there's also human psychology, history, maybe biology, physics, math, you name it. Like Julian Huxley said, life is just one damn relatedness after another.
Okay.
So to really get it, you need models from math, physics, biology, history, engineering, statistics, and definitely, maybe most importantly, psychology.
Psychology seems to get special attention in the Munger material we looked at. Why is understanding human behavior so critical for this worldly wisdom?
Well, because humans, right,
Yeah.
even really smart ones, we're wired with these psychological tendencies that often lead us completely astray, especially when things are uncertain or we're stressed.
Sure.
The sources spend a lot of time on what he calls the psychology of human misjudgment. He lays out maybe 25 or so key biases and behaviors that cause even brilliant people to make, well, what he calls totally bonkers mistakes.
Bonkers mistakes. Okay, can you give us a quick example or two? How might these biases show up for someone starting in business or finance?
Sure. A really big one is social proof. That's the tendency to just think and do what everyone else around you is doing,
Herd mentality.
pretty much. In investing, that means maybe jumping into a bubble just because everyone else is making money, right? You ignore the actual value. Another is over-optimism bias. We tend to overestimate our own skills or how likely good things are to happen.
Yeah, I can see that.
So a new entrepreneur might ignore really clear warning signs in the market, or a new investor takes on way, way too much risk because they feel overly confident. And then there's consistency and commitment tendency. Once you've publicly said you're doing something or committed to it, there's this huge psychological pressure to stick with it, even if it's clearly not working.
Right. Nobody likes admitting they were wrong. That's a tough one. And these biases, they don't just operate one by one, do they?
No, and that's where it gets really powerful and, frankly, dangerous. Munger talks about how they combine and interact to create what he calls Lollapalooza effects.
Lollapalooza effect.
Yeah, it's not just like 1 + 1, 2.
Yeah.
It's more like they compound and amplify each other, leading to these massive outcomes, often really negative ones.
Can you give an example?
Think about over-optimism combined with social proof in, say, a hot stock market. Everyone thinks prices will keep rising because, well, they see other people making money,
Right.
social proof, and they're optimistic about their own ability to get out in time. Over-optimism, it just feeds the delusion. Understanding how these forces work together is vital.
Wow. Okay, so for someone just starting out, just being aware of these psychological traps in yourself and in others, that seems like a really fundamental skill. Maybe even before you learn to read a balance sheet properly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources really frame it as avoid fooling yourself first.
Yeah.
That's a primary advantage. Munger looks at things like financial reports with, let's say, a healthy skepticism.
They're just tools.
Exactly, just a starting point. To really assess a business or an investment, you need that broader framework. You need psychology to judge if management is trustworthy. Are their incentives warping things? Are they being too optimistic? Are they stuck because of consistency bias?
And you need other models, too.
Right. Maybe engineering models to see structural risks, biology to think about competition, history to understand cycles. It forces you to pull ideas from lots of places, not just sticking to accounting or finance 101.
So it's about building this big mental toolkit, this lattice work you mentioned. He also talks quite a bit about using checklists. How do they fit in?
Checklists are the practical bit. They're the safeguard against just, human error. Even with all the right mental models rattling around in your head, smart people still mess up. They just miss stuff, especially when things get complex or stressful.
Like pilots before takeoff.
Exactly like that. Munger argues that using checklists forces you to systematically run through your mental models. Consider the key variables. Think about the potential pitfalls before you act. It prevents you from skipping something critical.
What kind of things would be on a Munger-style checklist?
Oh, it could be anything relevant. Checking for specific psychological biases influencing your judgment right now. Checking the incentives of everyone involved. Verifying key data points using different models or sources. Basically making sure you've covered the important bases from your multidisciplinary toolkit.
Okay, so learn the big models from different fields, understand psychology and its traps, use inversion to see what to avoid, use checklists to be systematic. It sounds like, well, quite a bit of work.
It is. It definitely is. But the sources also carry this strong sense of encouragement. It's doable, and it's incredibly valuable.
Right.
It just requires a huge amount of curiosity and really a commitment to learning for your whole life.
Right.
Munger and Buffett, they're painted as these relentless learning machines, always reading, always absorbing ideas from different areas.
He uses that story of the little red hen, doesn't he?
Yes, to illustrate the attitude you need. If the people around you aren't interested in building this kind of broad capability, well, you just have to be willing to do the work yourself. Nobody hands you worldly wisdom on a plate. You have to earn it.
And a big part of earning it seems to be learning from mistakes, especially other people's mistakes. He talks about studying downward spiral tales growing up.
That's a crucial point. Learning from your own mistakes is good, sure, but it can be really slow and incredibly painful.
Definitely painful.
So Munger is big on vicarious learning,
Yeah.
diligently studying the successes and the failures of others. history, biography. They're gold mines for this. All the anecdotes in the source material, they serve that purpose. They show how these principles played out for real people in real situations.
Like that story about Captain Cook and scurvy. Seems miles away from finance.
But it's perfect. He used simple psychology, right? Appealing to authority, creating social proof, to get sailors to eat sauerkraut and avoid scurvy. He didn't just order them, he put it on the officer's table first, made it seem desirable.
Ah, clever.
And that's a fantastic example of applying psychological models in a practical high-stakes situation. It's just as relevant to influencing behavior in a company as it was on an 18th century ship.
So the overall message from the sources is that developing this way of thinking, multidisciplinary, aware of psychology, it gives you a real edge.
A significant competitive advantage, yes. It's like Munger practicing tennis volleys close to the net, as he put it, mastering the fundamentals, the common pitfalls that many people neglect because they seem too basic or they require stepping outside their narrow specialty.
So this really isn't just abstract theory. It's presented as a very practical, robust way to navigate the actual world of business and finance, which is all about people, complex systems, incentives.
Right. And for someone new, this whole approach is framed as a way to cut through all that noise we talked about at the start, to develop, maybe, uncommon sense, to spot opportunities and dangers that people stuck in one way of thinking will just completely miss.
Tuning out the folly and recognizing the wisdom by pulling together the big ideas.
Precisely. It gives you a much stronger foundation for thinking clearly, making better decisions right from the beginning. It significantly lowers your chances of falling into those common traps, the ones driven by psychological biases or just a limited view of how things connect.
Yeah.
It's a path to setting yourself apart by cultivating a broader, more effective way of seeing things.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive into the wisdom from our source material on Charlie Munger, especially Poor Charlie's Almanack. For someone new to business and finance, the core problem it tackles is navigating all that complexity and information to make good choices and, importantly, avoid those painful mistakes. And the solution offered isn't a simple trick, but this deep, integrated idea of developing worldly wisdom.
Right. Which you get not by digging deeper into just one subject, but by building that lattice work of mental models, using the biggest, most important ideas from all the major fields with a special emphasis on psychology.
And you combine that broad understanding with practical methods like invert, always invert, using rigorous checklists, and really making an effort to learn from the mistakes of others.
Exactly. It all comes together as this powerful framework to help you think more clearly, see things others don't, and just dramatically improve your odds as you start your journey.
It's really a guide to developing a different, maybe more insightful perspective on the challenges and opportunities you're going to face.
It's about getting a toolkit for effective thinking that goes way beyond any single discipline.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on as you start thinking about these ideas. Given that we all have these powerful psychological biases, Munger points out, like over-optimism making risky things seem easy, or social proof pulling us into trends, or consistency bias making it hard to admit we're wrong. How might you intentionally, proactively build ways to challenge yourself? How could you set things up, maybe through processes or relationships, to force yourself to confront uncomfortable facts or opposing views when you're making those first crucial decisions in business or finance? How do you deliberately fight your own wiring? Something to think about.